Greetings and welcome back to the Casual Wargamer. There is an update coming either this week, end of this week, or end of next, where Games Workshop are updating the points and even rules for certain units and codices. And that might slightly invalidate something of what I'm going to talk about today. But I thought, well, I can always do another video if they do. So let's go for it. I thought, let's talk about Tyranids. Tyranids made their first appearance back in the Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, aka First Edition, rulebook back in '87. But they weren't an army in their own right, not for some time anyway. They were, along with Gene Stealers, which were completely separate at the time, an entry in the bestiary at the back of the book. You have to remember that with Rogue Trader, the idea was you had two players and a games master, and the games master would set up the scenario, set the armies up, and throw anything else in that they wanted to. So you had this almost like fantasy style bestiary at the back that contained anything from dinosaurs, which were an entry in there, to warp beasts, psychic vampires, enslavers. I think there's a giant tortoise thing as well, if I remember correctly, and groks. That's it, not tortoise, groks, which are like space reptile cow things the Imperium uses, and never seem to get a lot of attention anymore. Tyranids were weird though. Tyranids were still this extra galactic threat coming in from outside our galaxy, eating worlds, but they were kind of just a throwaway sort of threat if you wanted to. They only had one model and the artwork for it, and the one model they did at the time was just weird. It was kind of like a alien grey crossed with a velociraptor, holding a sort of familiar looking bio gun, but with these stabilizing fin wing things that stuck out the side from the back legs. It just looked weird. But that was a Tyranid. Gene Stealers were basically a homage to the xenomorph from the Alien films, and I think this is where the world of Yumgal originally appeared. And it was like this swamp planet with these giant leech creatures, and the Gene Stealers would basically implant their DNA into the leech through a bite, and then the young would burst out of the leech and would take on the appearances of whatever the host was. So I think the artwork, if I remember correctly, was this four-armed leech monster, which looked quite cool, but completely separate to Tyranids and completely different to what they became ultimately. I think it was some months into Warhammer 40k before Tyranids became a thing. I think Games Workshop realised quite early on that this was a popular concept. And over years, the Tyranids have gone through a number of changes. The biggest one sort of being that what we saw as a Tyranid in that book was actually now what we would call a gaunt, minus the weird stabilising wing flap things. Tyranids themselves changed with the Space Crusade, and I think like second edition, where they suddenly become this bipedal upright thing with a weird overly long giraffe neck holding big guns, which looked really silly to me. By the time you got to about third edition, though, they kind of settled on a general look, and they've slowly evolved them a little bit, but kept them roughly the same to what you had then. Gene Stealers were added into the mix to be the thing. Zoats were another thing that you had in Rogue Trader that were, well, it's a shame they got rid of Zoats. I always liked Zoats. I had at least one, if not two, Zoat models back in Rogue Trader, which were, for those who don't know what a Zoat is, kind of think of a lizard centaur. I think, if I remember correctly, there were 4 models back in the days of Rogue Trader. I think there was like two base bits. I think there was a base bit, which is the legs, and then you had the torso, which had its own weapons. I think they did like two base pieces, one with one leg up as though walking or trotting, and the other one's all four on the ground, if I remember correctly. But I think you had like one that had a missile launcher, one with a multi-melter, um, one with like a power fist and a flamer, I think, and something else. I forget the other. But they were the original moving ahead of the hive fleets, making contact, and being semi-autonomous. Something that races that they encountered would be willing to talk to, unless you were the Imperium. That obviously went the way of the dinosaur, and gene stealers were shoehorned into the Tyranids and basically did the same thing, ultimately leading to gene stealer cults about 18 months to 2 years into Rogue Trader. Tyranids themselves are a very popular army. They've always been quite a tough army. And one that up until relatively recently, I never used to actually enjoy playing against. And the main reason for that was prior to them changing to the AP modifier system, the original armor penetration rules were awful. They were terrible. So basically, if you had, say, and I mentioned this in other videos, and I'll probably repeat it over and over again, you had an AP system that basically said if this weapon is AP3, if you were an AP save of 3 or worse, you didn't get a save. It just automatically went through unless you had an invulnerable save. And that was things like multi-melters, las cannons, so on. And monsters. So anything classed as a monster, which was like your bloodthirsters, your greater demons rather, carnifexes, hive tyrants, anything like that, anything big and gribbly, had an AP3. And contrary to what a lot of people will tell you, previous editions were not shooty dominant. Believe you me, as a Space Marine player, I'm very much aware that the games were always very heavily skewed in the favour of assault. Yes, you could shoot things out on the way in, but once they hit you, they were often hitting you with twice the number of dice you got, often higher strength, so they were wounding easier, and generally had better AP than shooting attacks. And Tyranids were an army that was built very much around being assault-based. You had to take your troop choices, your troop tax, which was always gaunts, and whether you took the shooty ones or the stabby ones, you ended up having to take those, surging ahead of your army, taking the occasional shot, hoping you knock a body off of the defending unit, and then you made room for the monsters to charge in. At which point they would just wreck face. You also had some very silly rules in some of the early editions. 4th edition had an ability called Outflank, which meant units could come in on the sides of the tables. Ooh, let's do it that way. Sides of the tables. And one of the upgrades for Gene Stealers was actually to give them, I think it was called Scything Talons, which made them AP3. So you kept them in reserve. They walked in on the sides of the table. You didn't always get the choice of which side of the table. It was always coming in from the sides that were not the deployment zones. But they could basically walk in and then charge and tear through anything they hit and then move to the next one. And this was the thing. They were overly good in that ability. The whole point of Tyranids was that assault was their thing. Combat was their thing. They didn't want to shoot you. They had some shooting potential, but it was very minor. It was like orcs. You'd hit on 5s. Wasn't great. If you were lucky, you popped off a few models. They had quite strong psychic abilities prior to 10th. They had some nice abilities there. But the shooting was the weakness. They couldn't shoot you particularly well. And this is where one of my issues with Tyranids comes in and Games Workshop's design. over the last, I'd say 10 years, they've changed that. Slowly, they introduced, they came up with some really silly things, such as the Doom of Malantai, which was about the one unit you could certainly say was broken in 40k. Thankfully, that's no longer with us. But they adapted Tyranids to suddenly be able to shoot, which I suppose is a Tyranid thing. It adapts to what it needs to. But now I kind of feel that Tyranids don't have a weakness. Tyranids are, or can be, quite fast. You've got infiltrators, so if you need to start further up the table, you can do. Okay, your psychic powers are a little bit different in 10th. I can't complain there. But they certainly have gained a fair bit of shooting ability. And while AP isn't such the issue that it used to be, it kind of feels to me that Tyranids don't really have a dedicated weakness in the game. And I think every army should have a weakness. Now, you'll have to tell me whether you agree on that or whether you think there is a weakness and what that weakness is. But for me personally, I think they should be less shooty, more assault-based. Give them that slight edge in that regards, and take away some of the shooting elements. As it currently stands, though, with Tyranids, they have an interesting book. I know there are Tyranid players out there that don't particularly like it. They feel it's weak, it's underpowered, or it's just a bit meh. I think the problem is being the first, or one of the first. Well, it wasn't the first book of 10th, but being one of the first books, it's actually really, really balanced, and that's the problem. We know in the past of power creep. It's very much been a thing, and I think although Games Workshop seems to be trying to rein it in, it's still very much a thing. But how can I put this? Yeah, I think you've got a codex that when it first came out was really good. It and Space Marines being the first two books. But then you can see that other armies have, as they've come out, are better for one reason or another. So let's just take a look at what you've got. You have an army ride rule called Shadow in the Warp. And Shadow in the Warp is handy dandy. So it's a once per game effect. In either player's command phase, you can basically go, aha, Shadow in the Warp, and force every one of the enemy units to make a battle shock test. Now, to me, the point of this is if you do it in your opponent's turn, any that fail whilst holding objectives are not scoring those objectives, thus costing your opponent points, but preventing them from using stratagems. If you do it in your turn, and you have the same thing, potentially you take control of an objective that might otherwise have been contested or in your opponent's control, and again, you get a turn where they can't use stratagems on those units. If Battle Shock actually worked properly in the game, this would be a really good ability. Right now, I think, and I don't think they will change Shadow in the Warp in this upcoming rules thing, but I would have done Shadow in the Warp because it's a once per game effect. Have it so it triggers with like a -1 penalty, something like that. Make it slightly harder for your opponent to pass it, not massively so, but enough that it actually becomes viable. And you get, what is it, 6 detachments. And you've actually got some really nice detachments. You've got a couple I'm still not convinced on. Invasion Fleet is your default. It's the one that came in the data sheets when 10th dropped. And I find that throughout every codex that's come out, pretty much that original detachment is arguably the best because it's generic. It gives you a nice ability, and it's kind of playable, whereas the others are often far too specific. You've got Crusher Stampede for the people who like to play monsters. The problem is every time I see this being played, whether it's face-to-face across table, watching someone else's game, or watching a battle report, it fails abysmally. And it fails abysmally because people don't play it right. Yes, it's Crusher Stampede, it's meant for monsters, but nobody takes chaff units. Nobody wants to play gaunts and the like, but gaunts are what you need in this, because if your opponent shoots the gaunts that are incoming, they're not shooting your monsters. And yes, I know you want to wound your monsters a little bit. And if they don't shoot the gaunts and they shoot your monsters, the gaunts charge in and basically lock them in combat, ready for when the monsters get there. And nobody takes the chaff. And I think this is why it fails. It also fails because some of the missions in the Leviathan deck are not really conducive to it. Because you're taking these things and you want to run up the table and kill, but when you suddenly get told, go catch a table quarter or whatever. And also, I beat a Crusher Stampede list because we ended up drawing deploy servo skulls. So his monsters were forced to sit on objectives to be able to control them, to move them, and I just stood there and basically gunned down his entire army because he couldn't. If he wanted to score points, he had to sit them on there. It's a nice detachment in theory, but you've got to play it with a little bit of backup, and you've got to play it right. The Unending Swarm, nobody plays this. I've never seen this because nobody wants to play gaunts. Nobody wants to play the battle line tax, or troop tax as we used to call it. Nobody plays this. I've never seen anyone play it. It's on my list of detachments I still need to cross off, but nobody plays it. Nobody wants to play the huge number of gaunts required to do it. It's the same when people play orcs and they just go, oh, I'm just going to move this and just push the models up the table rather than moving them properly. The Assimilation Swarm. Now, I'm not overly convinced on this. I have played against it. Originally, I was like, this is really crap. It's one of, I think, it's a nice idea, but it doesn't always work. You've got to really know what you're doing with it. Now, thankfully, the opponent I played against who was using it had a very good idea on how it worked. He did win with it, but I think it was more dumb luck, dice rolls and so on. But I'm not really overly convinced on it. Vanguard Onslaught seems to work really, really well. A friend of mine plays it quite often in our local little 1K tournaments, and to him, I take this with a grain of salt, but to him, it's like, this is the only detachment that is worth playing for Tyranids. And I can kind of see what he means. He does very, very well with it. For him, he's a little bit of a, I won't say meta chaser, but I would say competitive player. And to him, this is the one that you play if you're going to play Nids. The others aren't worth it. I disagree. I think Invasion Fleet is better, but I can't argue the results he gets from playing Vanguard. And you've got the Synaptic Nexus, which I don't particularly like. I think it's a bit pants. I just don't think you've got. Same with the Simulation Swarm. Simulation Swarm. I think you don't have enough things to make it particularly viable. And it's not particularly, I don't find them particularly viable as concepts behind from a mechanical perspective. Now, the one thing that you have here is all these detachments are extremely thematic. These are what I would expect the stages of a Tyranid invasion to look like. They represent everything that you would see in a Tyranid army in one form or another. But I come back to what I said at the beginning of this little bit. It's very, very well balanced. There's nothing here that really stands out as being amazing. And that's the problem. Initially, it was fine. Now, I think it's lagging behind somewhat because everything that comes out since is perhaps a little bit more built around the changes they have made since 10th launched. I think it's fair to say the earlier codices were obviously built whilst the game was in development and we had the data sheets. whatever you want to call them. I think the codices we're starting to get now are obviously the ones that have been designed after some of the changes that have come through from 10th. And it's safe to say I think the Tyranid book is a little bit behind now. But it's balanced. If you are just playing, pardon me, if you are a competitive player, you'll be able to make something out of this. But some of your choices are going to have to be very specific. If you're playing casually, then this book works absolutely fine. The army works really, really fine. It will be interesting to see what Games Workshop do either this week or next with the Tyranid Codex, whether they make any changes to some of the rules. I mean, we know they're going to, because you won't be able to do that, pardon me, fire your spore mine things and do actions or contest objectives or whatever. Well, you can't really contest objective, though, see zero, but you know what I mean. You won't be able to do, it won't be viable to do that anymore. So the army is going to have to adapt, which means they're going to have to make changes to either the points, although I think it's more likely you'll see some rules changes to bring them in line with the newer codices coming out. So at the moment, my attitude towards Tyranids has changed. I actually really enjoy playing against them. I've played some big 3,000 point games. I've played some little 1,000 point games. I think I've even played like a 600 point game of 10th. It's a nice book now. It's a nice army, but it's missing that little bit of a oomph to make it better against, or not better, but make it up to where the game is going now. So we'll have to see. What are your thoughts on Tyranids? Let me know down below. Let's have a conversation, start a discussion. Yay, hit the thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button, and help me grow the channel. And pardon me. And let me know your thoughts on Tyranids in general, not just the mechanical things like the detachments and the abilities and the units, although I'd be interested on that. Let me know what your thoughts in Tyranids are in general. Anyway, thank you for watching, guys. I will continue to do a string of these videos covering each codex. I'll do them probably in order they were released, just for ease. So until next time, take care and good gaming.